Welcome to this episode of World Device, the Federal's weekly program that decodes international news developments of interest to you, our viewers. On Wednesday, August 23rd, that is tomorrow, the US and Russia will watch Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Kyiv closely to see whether he hugs Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whether the Zelensky hug is friendlier than his July hug of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It may seem churlish to suggest that Modi's visit to Ukraine is to make up for his Moscow trip in July. All the trouble for a prime minister to visit a nation at war just to keep the peace with allies? Why not? Symbolisms are important in politics, especially in international politics. Indian foreign policy, which prides itself as master of the diplomatic tightrope walk, in a tactical slip, messed up the timing of Modi's visit to Moscow last month. If it had been any normal run of the mill day, the US and its European allies would have probably looked the other way, ignored the visit. But no, whoever configured the schedule in Moscow or Delhi either played mischief or did it inadvertently. The visit on July 8th and 9th coincided with the meeting of European allies of the US and Ukraine in Washington, D.C. from July 9th to 11th to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the NATO military alliance. The issue of NATO and Ukraine's membership of it, if one recollects, was the main reason behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine on Feb 24, 2022, exactly 2.5 years ago. And here you have the NATO nation gathered in Washington, D.C., the main item on the agenda being the Russia Ukraine war. The meeting of the NATO nations intended, among other things, to show that Russia was an isolated nation with no friends in the world, but to the dismay of the US and NATO, the Indian Prime Minister, who they consider their friend, lands in Moscow and proceeds to warmly embrace Putin. Symbolically, it dented, if not punctured, the NATO grouping's carefully planned aim to project Russia in poor light. No surprise that Ukrainian President Zelensky tweeted on X that Modi's Moscow visit was, in quotes, a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow. To make matters worse, Russian military forces chose the exact day of Modi's visit to fire a missile on a children's hospital in Ukraine, killing 37 people, including 3 children. Some 170 were injured. Officials in the US Joe Biden administration were quoted by the media as expressing deep disappointment over Modi's visit to Moscow. One quote that did the rounds was attributed to the US National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan, who, referring to India, said, "Betting on Russia is not a good bet." US Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, kept aside his diplomatic cloak and trashed India's position that it follows strategic autonomy in international relations. Strategic autonomy in diplomacy means that India reserves the right to follow an independent path when it comes to deciding who its friends and foes are, irrespective of the context. But Garcetti brushed aside this view and bluntly said there can be no strategic autonomy in times of conflict. The tenor of US response bordered on anger, with officials making it clear to New Delhi not to take Washington for Granted, reports pointed out that US officials had actively sought out their Indian counterparts to try reschedule Modi visit before he left for Moscow, but they didn't succeed. A month later, on August 5th, Sheikh Hasina was deposed as Prime Minister of Bangladesh in a student led uprising. Reports, including one attributed to Hasina, have blamed the US for the removal of the Bangladesh regime. Whether the US was behind the coup is not known, but it is interesting to note that Hasina was particularly close to India. For New Delhi, the Hasina government was a trusted ally in South Asia who did its bidding. Among other things, Hasina cleaned up Bangladesh of militants from India's northeast who were operating from her country. She attempted to balance ties with China in a way that allowed India too to operate in Bangladesh. And she was inclined to sign several major projects, including the Teesta River Water Project with New Delhi, despite promising it to China earlier. Clearly, Hasina's exit was against India's interest. And if speculations about the US action in Dhaka are true, only one only needs to put two and two together. As the popular quote goes, understand the chronology. Well, but coming back to the current visit of Prime Minister Modi, there are other possibilities too during his visit to Ukraine. For instance, he said while departing that he would discuss how a peaceful resolution could be worked out to end the Ukraine-Russia war. While it is clear that India has an opening in both Moscow and Kiev, it can technically attempt to play the mediator. After all, there needs to be a credible reason for the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine. And trying to bring about peace between two warring nations is always a feel good reason. However, as it stands, the current situation does not lend itself to a peaceful resolution. On the contrary, the war has taken on an intriguing twist with Ukrainian forces entering Russian territory for the very first time. This development has occurred even as back channel negotiations were reportedly on between Russia and Ukraine in the Qatari capital, Doha. In the middle of the negotiations, Ukraine did the unthinkable. Putin was probably lulled into complacency because of the talks. Seizing the opportunity, Ukrainian military invaded Russian territory in Kursk. And as we speak today, they are still there in very large numbers. This has taken the Russian military completely by shock. It would seem that the negotiations may have been a smokescreen that allowed Ukraine to prepare itself for an attack on Russia. Putin did not see it coming. It does not require any great analysis to figure out that the Russian president must be livid. Consequently, any talk of peace is out of the question, at least at this moment. On the contrary, there are fears that the war will escalate. In the middle of all this, the chances that Modi will swing a deal appears pretty slim. New Delhi's right tightrope walk seems tricky in the manner that the US was upset with Modi's visit to Moscow. Russia may now feel slighted at the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Kiev. It's a diplomatic jam that New Delhi finds itself in. That is a problem or a challenge that India will have to deal with. The reality is, India can neither antagonize Russia or the US and its allies. India needs both for a variety of crucial reasons. As the war between Russia and Ukraine continues and nerves get frayed on both sides, it will be increasingly difficult for India to play neutral. At the same time, there is no question of India choosing sides, as that will have its own dire consequences. It may sound odd, but among the biggest beneficiaries of peace between Russia and Ukraine will be India, as it will be spared from having to make difficult choices. No one knows this better than India's foreign policy establishment. But can New Delhi do it? To try and somehow convince Zelensky and Putin to stop fighting? Let's see. Over to Kyiv.